turn it over to Nathan, who's going to give a presentation. Okay, Nathan.
Thank you. As we set up the... Okay. So let me say, by starting where I actually have some agreement with Commissioner Olhausen, which is privacy under the Brandeis idea of sort of harm to dignity is very hard to fit into competition. But one of the realities of the word privacy has ended up being a catch-all, might be almost a garbage can of so many different modern values, everything from equal rights for women under the abortion laws, to these dignity rights, to the value of the economic value of the control of data. I think it's the latter, which I think is the more specific part that becomes very important for competition policy. And that's the part where I'm going to talk about. And I would say my own recently launched organization, Data Justice, it was in some ways founded, not against, but saying that the language of privacy by many advocates on the progressive area, which I come out of, is not helpful to the discussion. It isn't concrete enough to actually get at the economic justice harms that I think are happening out there with consolidation around the control of data. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So talking about not Brandeis, but another thinker of the same progressive era who I think is relevant to this discussion. Old school data mining and Frederick Taylor, who talked about what is the value to companies of shifting control of information from the brains, in this case of workers, into the hands of the companies. In that case, it was the idea that the control of the process, the economic value of companies, and their competition with their competitors would be enhanced as they controlled the knowledge of the work process, not the skilled workers in their firms. The result of that shift of knowledge from workers to companies was by another thinker, Charlie Chaplin, who speed ups and pressure to lower wages as workers who once knew and had control over their own data no longer had that knowledge and could be standardized in ways, and economic profits of the companies increased. And you saw a great consolidation of industry in this period of mass production because control of data spread over a larger firm was actually a competitive advantage. And there was much reaction against competition, and much of the Sherman Act and later parts of antitrust were based on that vision of what was happening, even though, and I will actually argue, much of past social conflict can be reframed as a fight over control of information. And as we come into the modern era, thinking about that, social conflict and control of information I think lies at the heart of much of this discussion, where the word privacy can obscure it and make you sort of divide off things into a consumer protection versus competition, where I think once you understand it is about control of information, these two actually become bonded in many ways. So why the rise of big data platforms matter? You have Google, Facebook, many others organizing information about the world, about processes, but more importantly, about what's in the minds of consumers themselves. That's where what Frederick Taylor did and what modern data platforms do, and that the continuum, it's not information about the world, it's information that's in consumers' minds that matter most here. They reshape markets and they empower corporate advertisers to target, in some cases, prey on consumers based on profiling of what's in those consumers' minds. And control of more data is key to dominating these particular economic sectors, which in turn generates more data from consumers, fueling more market concentration. It is the idea that more data begets more data that creates the dynamics of concentration that is most at worry in these cases. And this rising information inequality in markets seems to underlie much of the rising broader economic inequality. The example of subprime mortgages, which was an example of price discrimination and data mining, where you said, you have the same credit rating as this other person, but I know you will take this worse deal because you don't know these better deals are out there. And so you had a whole series. We're not talking about where somebody gets a worse deal because they have a worse credit rating. They get a worse deal because they don't know there's a better deal, and they're given the exploding market. And a whole set of people were victimized based on that kind of data mining, of finding victims who could accept a worse deal than the other person similarly situated but not knowing. User data And this is the key thing. When you think about these data platforms, Facebook, Google, in some ways, their business model is very simple. Buy low, sell dear. They buy data essentially from their users at a very cheap price. They barter off user services at a cost far below the revenue that they're able to resell that data to advertisers. And when I'm going to talk about privacy, I would reframe it almost in intellectual property terms as the ability to control the monetization of your data at a price that fully compensates you for the value, which goes into a whole bunch of other issues of privacy. Encapsulates in modern parlance everything from being informed that the data is being used in ways that you might have an interest in, and the issue of, are you controlling it well enough that you have a chance to get its full economic value? Data platforms' revenues are based on harvesting the largely free labor of people putting up this data and encouraging users to provide private data without compensation. And users systematically undervalue the economic value of that personal data, and they often don't know it's being shared with their data. So you have a systematic problem of user lack of information, both about that it's being shared, but of its potential value. And control of information does create dominant market power. And I will argue, and I think the labor markets I started with, and these markets share one thing in common. And somebody like Joseph Stiglitz, who comes out of information markets, has had information economics, has had pretty good insight saying traditional product markets, for all the critiques and debates that there are around neoclassical economics in the sort of modern era of antitrust, at least there's some consensus there on how it works. And there are critiques. But the thing about labor markets, and I would argue these information markets, the price involved is subjective. What people are willing to pay a worker and what people are willing to accept is so based on situation, which is why there's often not a uniform wage price, and there's not a uniform price for the sale of data in many cases in this world. And the fact that products are being so systematically sold at different prices for different people based on subjective situation says that there's something happening here where, however poor the discussion of privacy is, there is a concrete economic function of where information is playing a role. And what is true, and this is the Stiglitz point, data is not worth buying just a little of in the big data world. You either buy a lot or you go home. Because, and this has happened with the consolidation of banks and consolidation of online data platforms. Big data is called big data for a reason. The correlations emerge through large, large data sets. So it's very hard for a small player to get into that game by that nature. And barriers to entry rise since potential competitors don't have the data themselves compared to the incumbents, and they don't have the concentrated computing power to process the data in that particular sector. And analyzing the maximum quantity of data and the correlations within data is trumping sort of the proverbial better mousetrap. I put up Deep Blue, which was the IBM computer in chess playing, because the frustration of modern artificial intelligence was it wasn't creating somebody who thinks like a person. It's developing somebody who knows every chess move that's ever been played that actually gave the advantage in playing chess. So it wasn't having a smart computer, it was having a computer with lots of data that eventually beat a grandmaster chess player. And so that is the trajectory here, that more data is what wins in the marketplace. And the point is not how easy it is for users to shift between competing platforms. They are irrelevant to competition analysis. But what is relevant is, can an advertiser choose not to go with a dominant player on these sort of two-sided markets at least? And is a competitor a substitute for the dominant player? And the evidence of this market power is, one example is that Google, of course, makes more money than all of their competitors. What's interesting is they make more money for a click on the same keyword. And it doesn't matter how many clicks. For the same keyword, they make more money. And the premium price they get says it's not just that you found a user, because if you find a user on Bing or Yahoo or whatever, you still pay more to Google for finding that same person there. And that goes to the idea that there's something about getting the data through Google that gets them a premium. And I will note the FTC decision on Google back in 2013 was about them as a search engine and their search company. It actually didn't rule on what they're advertising on. So the reuse, did you say 1 minute?
1 minute.
Okay, so I'll go very quick. The reuse of data spreads, what's important is they get data from many other sectors across, and that actually reinforces it. So whether it's Android, the fact that Google and other companies keep spreading out into new data sources says that their business model says more data matters. So, and I will say, and I'll go maybe into questions on this, price discrimination is where there's some consumer harm. This is where using this data, you actually are able to target people, like with subprime mortgages, for worse deals. And that's where the concrete harm of lost, not privacy per se, but control of your data harms consumers. And I would argue that, at its core, is the problem we're talking about here. And the final thing is, I'll leave this graph, which is, as we've had the era of big data, we've seen progressively less of the returns of recoveries going to average households. I'm not going to say big data has caused rising economic inequality. There's a large debate out there. But I will argue, I think it's a part of the debate we have to have of why we've had this rising economic inequality.
Okay. Thank you, Nathan. All right. Have a different view on the viability of this foreclosure theory, and I just, so why are they wrong? Tell me why they're wrong, and
Sure.
Of course, anyone after Nathan responds, I'd like to their reply and reply briefs allowed. So go ahead.
So I'd first answer the ubiquity of data out there question, which is, in a certain sense, those selling data don't have the best data, and those with the best data don't sell it. You look at the ones who are actually getting ongoing, real-time, sort of as people act information. That's Amazon, that's Google, that's Facebook. Really only a handful of folks who are getting almost minute to minute on the internet. Those are pretty unique. And the amount of data being sold by the data brokers and their revenue is tiny compared to Google. You could add up every single data broker and all their annual revenue, and it's less than Google alone, much less Google plus Facebook plus Amazon, et cetera. I mean, that data, just by the revenue of those companies, is not at the same value. The other part of it, and this goes to how data is used and which data matters, the data that matters is what people bought. That's a useful piece of data, but also it's what people are thinking about, their intentionality, which is very much real time. And what a company, especially that's selling to advertisers, and this is where the foreclosure is not I control all of search or I control all of online services, because that's the free part. What they want to control is that an advertiser won't go to their competitor. And what you deliver to your advertisers is, I know what this person wants to buy, one, but more importantly, I know what price they're likely to buy it to. And that's a whole set of behavioral profiling that seems to uniquely increase with the amount of data. When you combine what videos you watch, what you've sent in email, it's also the diversity of data. I think that's also important. Your grocery store knows a lot about one thing, what you bought. They know nothing about what movies you watch. Some other company may know a lot about what you do online in this area because they're a specialized site. What's unique is a few companies, and again, Facebook and Google are very important here because they actually are spreading out into multiple areas. They combine a diverse profile of people that gives them ability to deliver something almost nobody in specialized areas can do. Not that the specialized companies can't make revenue, but it's on a far smaller scale. And I think that's what's important. It's the diversity and the fact that what advertisers want, and this goes to this issue of price discrimination, the value of being able to charge different prices to different users and knowing how to profile them, I think is ubiquitous in this new economy. And I think that's what's under-discussed in this whole area.
Okay. Kind of what Andres is saying, okay, well, lots of stuff going on here. How do I know that, how do we know whether that I'm giving up too much data, I'm not getting the value for my data, as was in your presentation and some of your writing?
I think the key phrase that Andres gave was implicit deal, that consumers know what's happening. And every survey out there says they don't. They neither know it's being shared with third parties overall, or that the value that it has, because a lot of times they don't know the value because the value will be figured out later. People may just say, well, tough luck, they gave it up, it's gone. That's not how we actually treat intellectual property. And that's why I sort of started off there. the idea of certain kinds of the value of stuff, if it belongs to you, is just because somebody's smarter and figures out how to use it over there before you do, you still have the right to afterwards say, you used something that was valuable without my permission for that use. And if you start to think of privacy as this catch-all of a lot of things, the right to control how my personal data is monetized, there is no deal. Nobody has been told this is happening either up front because most of them don't know, so the message hasn't gone through. No meeting of minds in the deal. Secondly, they don't know that it was going to be used X way because that's figured out after that deal's made. So there's no way they could have known that use was going to be done. So if we reconceive privacy more along the idea that people have an ongoing right over their data, and I think that's in many ways how some people talk about it, that's where this zero price point is a problem because it prevents a friction point. And this is where the behavioral economics, the minute there's even a single penny at stake, people start to ask these questions. Is this worth even a penny? It's amazing when you think about it, the elaborate auction system, so precise with Google and Facebook on how they price all these little ads, and then this barter situation on the consumer side. I don't think that's accidental. Barter, as I once said in an article, is in the history is of trading trinkets so you then can take something valuable from the people you bartered with and then sell it in real markets for far higher value. And I think that's what we have is sort of the primitive tribes of users online being exploited in these barter situations at a zero price and then the value being redone. So, and I think why it matters in competition is if somebody gets there first, they collect a lot of data very rapidly and cement control of information in that area in a way nobody else can come in. If there was stronger privacy protection in this way, not in the dignity harm way, but in this I get control of monetizing, nobody would then control so much data that nobody else could get in. And I think that's the link between the privacy in this control of monetization data sense and competition.
In an antitrust profession, if that price discrimination is not something we should worry about as a general matter, and because it's theoretically ambiguous, and in general we think it's probably gonna be fairly helpful and increase output. So I like to ask you that, Nathan, and then I think Darren had some thoughts, or anyone else who has some thoughts on that, and then we can open it up to a few questions before we have to adjourn.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't invoke price discrimination on the legal side. I mean, Robinson, Patman, ignoring the law on the books is a tradition on this, so I won't push that. I'm just going to say that
I just want to push that it's not that they ignore the law in the books. I think they ignore the law in the books because the economic consensus is that this isn't something we should care about.
Right.
So it's not.
I understand,
yeah, okay.
But I'm just saying. So it isn't about the law; it's about the economic consensus. And part of what's challenging is that economic consensus. It isn't that price discrimination is happening and that's the violation of the law. It's because price discrimination is empowered, and we should talk about markets. It's true. We aren't talking about competition in the market for real estate services. Trulia, et cetera, is in that market. Google actually isn't, although they could jump in, but they're not. But the question is, when you talk about Google, for example, it's search advertising is at least potentially the relevant market. And the question is the data Trulia have useful for if they wanted to jump into search advertising and so on? And this is where price discrimination matters because a company pays arguably a premium to Google for the same click, which is my point. And that makes it very hard for a competitor who can't get paid the same for clicks on fewer clicks to even go into that market. And I think it's worth talking when we talk about practically is whether it's free stuff, what users are getting is the degree of profit that a company like Google has is extremely large. And that is as good an empirical example of where the consumer surplus of the deals happening is going. And just talking about overall, whether what Google has done with a lot of its revenue is first put it into a big pile of cash. Second, and they've got it, so a lot of it hasn't gone back to the users objectively because they couldn't have as much cash on hand if the revenue coming in was meeting what they were spending. Plus, a large chunk of that revenue has gone into subsidizing essentially money-losing endeavors like Android and all their other endeavors, because what they make their money on is search advertising. And those other endeavors that lose money implicitly help them because it gives them more data, adding to the evidence that getting the data is what drives their profit. So I think there is the thing. And I do want to add the one last thing is,
Sure.
Does price discrimination happen? Almost every company that sells on the web has a little thing called a promo code. Most advertisements are offering promo codes to some people that other people never see. Price discrimination through sales in the literature is implicit, and such sales are endemic on the internet. And a lot of what happens on the internet is non-good sales, finance, et cetera, with lead generation, directing people to different companies based on their category. So a lot of the price discrimination happens on which payday lender you might get sent to. So I think there's a lot of implicit price discrimination that doesn't show up by reputable firms changing their prices, but happens on how you get directed. I would say the studies that have been shown is that there are even though there's lots of small new entrants coming into the ecosystem, there's far fewer of the small companies becoming bigger companies. These are Kaufman studies. There are many other studies that the barrier to entry to becoming part of the S&P 500 is far larger than it used to be. There used to be far more companies that would start small and become large, and that's not happening as much as it used to be, just across the economy. What? Yeah, there's quite a bit.